Welcome to the Next Level Human podcast. As a human, you have a job to do. In fact, you have 4 jobs: to earn and manage money, to attain and maintain health and fitness, to build and sustain personal relationships, to find meaning and make a difference. None of these jobs are taught in school, and that is what this podcast is designed to do: to educate us all on living our most fulfilled lives through the mastery of these 4 jobs. I'm your host, Dr. Jade Teta, and I believe we are here living this life for 3 reasons, and 3 reasons only: to learn, to teach, and to love. In this podcast, I will be learning, teaching, and loving right along with you. I'm grateful to have your company. Here's to our next level. What's going on, everybody? It's Dr. Jade Teta here. It's a Next Level Human podcast. And my guest today is the functional nutritionist, Erin Holt. And we are going to be talking about functional medicine, the good and the bad and the ugly. Now, let me just cue up Erin. Erin and I, like a lot of us nowadays, we met on social media, just started following each other, and I just quickly started to love her content. She reached out to me and was like, hey, will you be on my podcast? And of course, I had been meaning to reach out to her, wanting her on this podcast. And so it was sort of this serendipitous sort of event. And so now we've done a podcast swap and become buds. And now I get to share her with you. And let's just start out, Erin, maybe with a little bit of your story. How did you get into this? And one of the things, any place you want to start, because I think you and I both, as we were talking about before we queued up the recording, functional medicine is what we both do. We both have a lot of problems with it. And obviously it's our work, so we love it, but we have a lot of problems with it. And problems meaning the way that a lot of people practice perhaps is not necessarily what we might deem as, well, you said it before we queued up the recording, root cause medicine, getting to the underlying issue. How come so many people who come to functional medicine from traditional medicine are still not seeing much better results? So let's start there, just a little bit about your story in terms of how you got into this work, and then your philosophy about functional medicine in general and what it gets right and what it gets wrong.
Yeah, so I'll kind of take it from the top a little bit, so folks who are not familiar with my background can get more familiar with the approach I take and why. I went to, right out of high school, I went to college for marketing in Boston, a school called Northeastern. And that's where I discovered bulimia, which is a super weird thing to say, but that's how it happened. I had been struggling with disordered eating, with restriction and overexercise for 5 years, since I was 13. And then all of a sudden, this like new modality was introduced to me in college. And unfortunately, that really took a strong hold over me. And it was something I battled for 8 years after that. And I kind of bebopped around in school. People were like, oh, what college did you go to? I'm like, all of them. I went to all of them. I was in California. I was in New Hampshire. I was all over the place. And eventually I realized, I was in my early 20s. I'm like, I got to get my shit together. I mean, I'm still struggling with this eating disorder. I recognize it's a massive problem, but I was telling myself a story that as soon as I fix myself, as soon as I get to my ideal weight, as soon as I can feel good in my own skin, then I can put these behaviors to bed once and for all. That was a story that I was telling myself over and over and over again. I can put away the self-hatred. I can put away the shame that comes part and parcel with disordered eating. And so I decided, I know what I can do. I'll fix myself. I'll go back to school for dietetics. And so I went to dietetics school to become a registered dietitian. And there's so much about that program that I absolutely loved. I loved the science. I loved the deep understanding of our bodies. But what I didn't love was I wasn't any better at the end of those 4 years. In fact, I was a lot worse with my eating disorder. So I didn't learn any tools to help myself. And I'm like, if I can't help me, how can I help others? And I had some issues with, at the time, that was back in 2010 when I graduated, it was called the American Dietetic Association. It's now called the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. But I had some issues with the fact that they, were sponsored by the American Beverage Association, which is like a lobbying group for like soda, essentially. And there wasn't really space to discuss that. It was kind of like, this is the way it is, therefore this is the way it is, which rubbed me the wrong way. And I just want to shout out, because there's a lot of people up in arms about the Washington Post article that came out a couple of weeks ago about how dietitians are being paid by like big beverage, essentially, to talk about this stuff. I'm like, I completely understand why people are upset about that, but that has like never not been the case with dietetics. Like it's always been sponsored. It's always collected funds from the beverage industry. And I just don't think people really understand that. So anyway, I decided that wasn't really the path for me. I remember talking to a advisor at the time explaining like, this is what I want to do. Here's exactly how I want to help people. And she told me that career doesn't exist. So that's when I realized, oh, okay, I guess I have to like figure this out and build it myself. Now, at the time I was in dietetic school, I was also simultaneously in school for energy medicine, intuitive medicine, clairvoyance, which is like the ability to see energy clearly. So I had sort of like an interesting education. It was very different. And I decided to lean more into that. So I went to school to be certified for a health coach after I graduated. I did a yoga teacher training. I started practicing and teaching a lot of yoga, and it was through these like alternative health modalities that I started to heal, that the eating disorder sort of just went away. And so much of that was by taking the focus off of the food, not being hyper fixated on the food, but taking the focus off of the food. It's kind of like, I'm a whole human. I have all these other aspects of my life that influence my health. It kind of reminds me of the Whitman quote. What is it? Like, I'm large, I contain multitudes. Like there's just so much going on that to only fixate on food as an opportunity for healing sometimes misses the mark. And so I was kind of just like living my best life at the time. That's when I met my husband. We got married, had a baby, bought a house, like check. I'm doing it. I was teaching yoga. I was running my nutrition practice, like all things great. And I started getting really, really sick. And it just didn't seem to make sense. Like I meditated, I hydrated, I ate well, like what the hell is going on? And that started a year-long journey of me going to the doctors. I mean, everybody listening probably has some version of this story. I'm going to the doctors and saying, I really don't feel well. They're like, yeah, there's nothing wrong with you. Your labs look normal. A lot of people told me like, oh, this is just because you're a new mom. Like as a society, we're like collectively really okay with moms feeling like shit all the time. They're like, yep, normal. Sorry. Just the way it goes. They're like, do you want some medication? And they meant like for my mind, let's just dull you out. Let's just like numb all these feelings. That was really the only solution for me. And I remember one day, my thumb swelled up to 2 sizes, the like twice the size it's supposed to be. And I finally like marched into the doctor's office and I'm like, look, I'm not leaving until we figure out what's going on. And that's how I was diagnosed with an autoimmune condition called systemic sclerosis or scleroderma, which is like, don't Google that. That's one of the bad ones. That's a scary one. Like stay away from Google. But I mean, as you know, it's like just getting that diagnosis. Well, sometimes it can feel really validating. Like, see, I knew something was wrong with me. I knew my body. It's just the beginning, because conventional medicine doesn't really have a whole lot of answers or solutions or support for chronic illness or autoimmunity. It's just kind of like this big question mark of like, yeah, your body's turning on itself. We don't really know why. Kind of weird. Here's some medications, the best we can do. And that didn't sit right with me. So that's really how I found functional medicine. And it provided me a resource when I felt like I had none, because functional medicine at its core is a root cause approach. So there's this idea, and I think this is where there's a lot of overlap with functional medicine and naturopathic medicine. You can speak more to this, but there's this idea that the body doesn't make mistakes. The body doesn't just like turn on itself, right? We don't just move from a healthy state into a disease state. And I really wanted to unpack and understand what was going on and the whys behind this. And functional medicine gave me a lot of resources and a lot of tools do that. And that's how I started practicing. And that's really where I sort of built a name for myself and had a lot of success, not just in my own healing, but also with my clients and within my practice. And, I'll pause there because that was a mouthful of words, and we can kind of talk about where I started seeing things go south with functional medicine. But that was really my introduction into functional medicine.
Yeah, no, I love that because I love the story. Part of the reason that this is the Next Level Human podcast is because, from my perspective, what you did was the hero's journey, right? And we all have this, where essentially you basically went on this journey. You got sick again. Did not know what was going on, but it took you to a place that allowed you to heal yourself, enrich others, and evolve the world in general, which brought you to your work. So to me, that's the point of the Next Level Human podcast. So I love all that as it sets us up. One thing I'll say that's interesting, naturopathic medicine, I've always said that's the worst marketing decision ever. And actually, in my mind, Jeffrey Bland and Dr. Pizzorno, who founded Bastyr University, those two are the ones that got together and they essentially rebranded naturopathic medicine as functional medicine. So to me, they are very much the same, although I do think, true naturopathic doctors, some of what happened when naturopathic medicine sort of became functional medicine is we lost some of the natural, of the natural roots. Some of that was good, by the way, because some of that stuff is, has been shown not to be effective, and some of it is bad. But now we have something that I think is the correct bridge between traditional medicine and sort of more alternative medicine. And so I do think that they are essentially the same. And I am happy that naturopathic medicine was kind of rebranded as functional medicine. It allowed many traditional practitioners to come into a space that they normally wouldn't have. Now, of course, I have many issues with medicine in general, and I'm going to just start and share a little bit of my thoughts. This is something you and I really haven't talked about yet, Aaron, but I'll share a little bit of my thoughts so you can comment on them and we can together perhaps educate the listeners. So my thoughts on this are the following. And the big one is going to be a shock to most people who are listening, probably not to you, Aaron, but I've been doing this work for a very long time of personal training, starting at 15 years old, biochemistry, naturopathic medicine. Now I'm, transpersonal psychology, PhD. I've been doing this work for a long time, and tons of books, thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of hours studying. And where I have come to is that honestly, we don't really know that much about metabolism, about health in general. Now, I would say, and by the way, everyone, as I say this, I don't know what Aaron may agree, may disagree. So we're just going to have a conversation. But to me, I go, traditional medicine to me is has some utility, right? Obviously, extra. If you break your arm, you get in a serious car accident, you need emergency service. You definitely want to go the conventional route. But Aaron sort of clued us in is that they fail miserably at chronic illness. And honestly, I'm just going to come out and say this. I do think functional medicine does a better job. I actually don't think it does a good job. I don't. And this coming from someone who's been in this field for, a very long time. And then the question is why, right? And I just want to start there. And I'll give you just a couple reasons of why I think it doesn't do a good job. Because from my perspective, it ignores too much of what is important for the human organism to function. Diet and exercise are incredibly important. They are not the end all be all, and functional medicine treats it like it is. That's my first problem with functional medicine. My second problem with functional medicine is that it essentially does greenwashed allopathic medicine. It's essentially, substitute a supplement for a drug. And so we talk about the pharmaceutical industries and the money involved there. Well, that's beginning to become the same situation in the supplement industry as well. And part of this is just as something becomes more popular, that's just partly what happens. And the final thing I'll say here is that the functional medicine in another place is, evidence-based in some areas and completely off their rocker in other areas, especially as it pertains to blood laboratory testing and things like that. Now, part of it is that we are evolving. Traditional medicine and functional medicine are both evolving. I far and away, obviously, would choose functional medicine over traditional medicine for chronic disease. I just still think we're missing something. And I want to pose that to you and say, is this something that you're shocked to hear from me? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And if you agree or disagree, how would you correct this, or what would be your thoughts, as far as this goes?
I mean, I think I know this from your body of work that I've been exposed to over the past probably like 6, 7, 8 years, but also through our conversation on my podcast. And like, we are so in lockstep with the way that we see things. Obviously, we're going to see things from slightly different approach based on our client base. But the fact that you're a man and I'm a woman, we might see things differently, different perspective. It's a beautiful thing. But everything you just said, I completely agree with. And I'll speak into the first thing you said, which is that functional medicine can miss the mark with chronic illness too. So this is what's happening, is that people are sort of being like dropped by conventional medicine. And then they hear about this functional approach and they're like, this is the way, this is the future, this is the salvation. And in some ways, yes, but then they get failed by functional medicine. And then they're hopeless. They're like, where do I go? If this didn't work, nothing works. But I think the part of the problem is that with functional medicine, we take a very overly simplistic view to something that is very complex. And I have seen exactly 0 people heal their autoimmunity from doing a leaky gut protocol. And yet we propose it as like, oh, all you have to do is heal your gut. All you have to do is heal up that leaky gut, and then autoimmunity just poof disappears. It doesn't work that way. It's like false promises. And I think one of the people that I've learned from that I really, really respect is Dr. Karazian. And I kind of like that he's a bit of a rabble rouser. He's a little bit of a shit talker. I love that about him, because I think we have to hold each other to a high standard and hold each other accountable. And he does that. And he was talking about the fact that a lot of his education is online now. And so he's able to track how much of, how do I say this? Like, if you run an online program, you can see behind the scenes, like what people are watching and like where they come in and how long they're watching the modules and that sort of thing. And he said that the vast majority of his practitioners that do his practitioner trainings skip the first module, which is all about mechanisms. So they want to skip the mechanisms and they want to just jump right into the protocols. And I think that encapsulates where functional medicine practitioners can really fail people, because we have to have a deep understanding of why we're doing what we're doing and why we're making the recommendations that we're making. Functional medicine isn't just protocol after protocol after protocol. It's more than a $400 stool test in a leaky gut protocol. And if that's the approach that many people are taking, no wonder why we're failing people. No wonder why. I started to see this. I love pattern recognition. I'm just like kind of obsessed with like putting the puzzle pieces together. And a few years ago, I started to notice that the people coming to my practice were people who had already worked with other functional providers. And I'm like, well, this is weird. Because when I first started, nobody knew what functional nutrition was. I started my podcast, the Functional Nutrition Podcast, and somebody was like, you probably shouldn't call it that because nobody knows what functional nutrition is. This was 6 years ago. So that's how much times have changed, right? But so in the beginning, I was kind of educating people about what functional nutrition, functional medicine was, all this, that sort of thing. Nobody knew what it was. And then all of a sudden people were coming to me being like, oh, I've already worked with 3, 4 functional providers, sometimes at like the big fancy, like brand name clinics. Like they had invested like $10,000 in labs and they were coming to me being like, I'm more confused than when I started. And so I started to really see like, oh, okay. So functional medicine, like not all functional providers are providing in the same way. So what really separates the people that are getting their clients and their patients real sustainable results and those who are just kind of, like you said, greenwashing a conventional approach, which is problem, like instead of pill for every ill, it's a supplement for every, off balance lab marker, because that isn't the way that we're going to get people healthy.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And it doesn't surprise me. You're right that we agree on this, although I didn't know where you were going to go with that. And I want to just present one model that has helped me just for the listeners. They will have heard this before, so I'm presenting it. You may not have. I'll just present it because for me, you said something really interesting that most of what I've been interested in, just because of the way my brain works, is mechanism and taking big ideas and trying to figure out how to individualize what I do. Because from my perspective, this is another problem. It's a huge problem with traditional medicine. Everyone is treated the same. And evidence-based medicine, if you're going to use that term, it's just basically now you're taking a tool that was made for averages, research, and are trying to apply it to every individual. Well, research isn't a tool for individuals, it's a tool for averages. Doesn't mean we don't want to pay attention to it. It's very important. It just doesn't say what is going on with this individual, sort of in front of me. And so to me, individual medicine is, sort of critical. And I am, really struggle with trying to come up with models that I can truly individualize medicine with, right? So one of them I want to present here because I do think functional medicine, I don't think they need to have this model, but I think if they started thinking more in this regard, things would get a little bit better. So from my perspective, if we look at health from a functional perspective, we kind of have to go, well, what all goes into health? And from my perspective, there is the individual nature of the person. So what does that entail? Try to come up with a broad framework. So for me, it's their physiology, their psychology, which has to do with their mindset. And, we can even go into, things around energy medicine would fall into this psychological energy component. Their personal preferences, what they like, what they don't like. And of course, their practical circumstances, what kind of toxicity is in their environment, from the people to the food to the, what they have available. I have a Whole Foods down the street. I have, a Greenway in my backyard. And then we have to match that with the choices. And to me, I also do these choices in big buckets. They are mindset/mindfulness, which is really about how we think about the world, our perceptions, and what is going on in our energy systems in our body. And what I mean by that is psychological. And I also mean energy systems like, the old Hindu traditions of energy networks and chakras and meridians in the Chinese system and things like that. Movement. Are we sitters or are we movers? Then we go into meals, what we eat, and metabolics, what we're doing to push our metabolism forward, whether that be exercise, supplements, drugs, cold plunges, whatever it is. Part of the problem from my perspective is that, first of all, that first part, those 4 P's, physiology, psychology, preferences, and practical circumstances, are pretty much ignored for just physiology. Even still, even in functional medicine, most people pay very little attention to psychology or preferences or practical circumstances. It's all physiology. So we're missing 3 in my mind out of the 4 important elements of individuality in functional medicine and traditional medicine, both. And then, of course, when we look at on the choice side, it's really all about meals and metabolics, meals and metabolics, meals and metabolics. And most people struggle with the meals because of their personal preferences and practical circumstances. So it really just comes back to metabolics on the functional side. And we're missing the movement part and we're missing the mindset part. And to me, not that these 2 models would solve the problem, but that to me is the starting point, that we have to begin, in a sense, to take a reevaluation of the roadmap and begin to go, where are we? How do we make sense of all this information and sort of what to do next? And so I'm just wondering your thoughts on that, not necessarily the model, but just more, that's my just take on what we're doing wrong and why everything is so confusing. So I just want to hear from you so the listener can kind of understand, okay, well, how's Erin thinking about this then? How does she simplify it for her clients when they work for her? And how can I make this more simple in my life and really start doing real individualized, functional medicine, healthy medicine?
I don't think it's dissimilar to what you were saying, which is, or the way that I kind of look at health is through the lens of 4 different bodies. So we have the physical body, which is, a lot of what we tend to focus on with medicine and with health, with functional medicine, with nutrition. But we also have the mental body, which you touched upon. We have the emotional body, and we have the energetic body, like energy anatomy. That would be the chakras that you kind of alluded to, the meridians in the body. And they all have to be addressed and acknowledged. And they're all on-ramps. The big thing that I've been seeing that bothers me is that like it's very much so a this or that mentality where it's like there's one right way to heal and this is the right way. And it's almost like whoever's the loudest voice in the room gets the attention. It's like, I guess that's the right way. And what in reality, what I'm trying to do over the past, at least a year is teach people that it's all on the table. It all gets to be an avenue or an on-ramp for healing. We don't want to take healing opportunities away from people. We want to give them more. We want to give them more access. And so for maybe somebody's on-ramp into their own healing journey is, I'm just going to clean up my diet. I'm going to eat more veggies. Depending on who I'm talking to, veggies are still safe territory.
Yeah.
But I'm going to eat more broccoli, or I'm going to drink more water. I'm going to move my body more. My on-ramp to healing is really more of that physical body. For some people, it's like, I'm going to pay attention to the stories that I'm telling myself about myself. I'm going to listen to the self-talk. I'm going to recognize, is this self-flagellation or am I being kind to myself? Is there a way to access more compassion for myself? And for some people, it's energy healing. Like they go see an energy healer or they practice a meditation. You and I were talking about Joe Dispenza beforehand. They practice a meditation style that's really more focused on the energy body. It all gets to work. And it can all work together, or you can choose one to start. But I get so frustrated with this idea that there's only one way. And I think that it really pigeonholes people. The other thing that you said that I completely agree with is like research versus actual practice. And sometimes the people with the biggest accounts, with the most influence, with the loudest voice, they're not actually working with human bodies. They're talking about research and they're talking about theory. And what we know as people who actually practice, we're in the trenches with people, it's that there's nothing more humbling than coming to a client appointment with your convicted beliefs, like this is what I believe. And then realizing in that moment, like, yikes, this belief doesn't apply here. And you're like humbled to your knees, you're leveled to the ground and you're like, oh my gosh. But it's such a potential for growth on the other side of that, to see things in a new way, to open your perspective, to widen the lens. And I think that is what allows us to be more compassionate providers, for us to recognize, gosh, there really is more than one way here. But sadly, most people aren't getting access to that approach. Most people are getting access to the loudest influencer in the room, which is like, it's like clickbait material. It's like, I could go on a tear about like the misinformation vigilantes that are rampant right now. And in some ways it's really good work holding people accountable. And in some ways it really lacks compassion and understanding of what people are going through.
I'm sorry to break into the show, but I wanted to take a second to cover one of our sponsors and tell you all about Paleo Valley at paleovalley.com. These are the grass-fed sticks that I tell you all so much about, that all of my friends know I have on hand constantly. They are in my car. They are at my house. I keep them at my sister's home and my parents' house. I have these things everywhere because they are the simplest, most convenient whole foods protein supplement you can get. Almost like carrying around pure protein, low-carb protein in your pocket. They also, these Paleo Valley beef sticks, are the only 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef sticks on the market. They use organic spices. They are naturally fermented instead of using nitrates and nitrites that can be a problem in some of these cured meats. And they simply taste fantastic. Check out the original or the jalapeno. Those are my favorites. Please make sure you go over to paleovalley.com and visit. When checking out, use the code NEXTLEVEL for a 15% discount. Remember, our sponsors keep the show going by you giving them your patronage and spending your money on these high quality products. You actually do a few things. One, you're helping to support the podcast. And two, you are helping your health. And three, you are making sure that good quality companies like Paleo Valley can be out there doing their business, changing the world, making the earth better. One of the things you may not know about this is that grass-fed organic and grass-finished beef is doing something that is so utterly important for our environment, actually helping to repopulate the topsoil. A lot of people don't know this, but our topsoil is being extremely depleted. And raising animals, especially cattle, the correct way helps to get that topsoil back. This is one of the reasons why I love Paleo Valley. Not to mention it tastes fantastic, but they're one of these companies, like my other sponsors, Cured Nutrition and Organifi, that are doing the right things by the environment. I really appreciate everything they do, and I hope you will check them out. Thanks so much. PaleoValley.com. Use the code NEXTLEVEL. And now, back to the show. Yeah. Actually, I'll say something that might surprise you, Aaron. It might surprise some of the listeners. So I've done podcast episodes on disinformation, misinformation for a very long time. It was, kept me up at night. Like literally, I would be worried about, especially, when COVID first hit and other things.
Oh,
and then I got to a place where I was like, it's really interesting the way human evolution works. Like to me, I'm like, if I believe that this really is an individual approach, and you have to be an individual. What is, I think, happening might actually be beneficial. And this is sort of really hard for me to kind of come to this awareness and understand. I was like, well, if everywhere you look, you're confused about what to do, right? And you don't know who to trust, then maybe this is what is needed for people to finally stop outsourcing their knowledge base about their body and their mind and their spirit to other people. And maybe finally, because there's so much contradictory information out there, they will finally start to do what I think we all should have been doing all along, which is to be on our own journey of health. One of the things that I will say, I agree with you. Like, I've had very few. A lot of people, they say, Jade, surely you don't mean that. But I'll tell everyone. I've said this on the podcast before. I've had very few success stories in my career over 30 years of doing this. Very few. And people go, why would you even say that, Jade? I say that because this is the nature of the business I'm in. I oftentimes get asked with people, they're like, what do you do for a living? I'm like, well, I do metabolism work mainly in, for most of my career, physical transformation. And they ask me, what's that like? And I'm like, well, if you want to fail most of the time, then you might love my work. And this to me is a lot of what it's like being in the functional medicine world. You fail a lot of the time. And part of the reason you fail is because you don't necessarily know what to do with the individual. But when I started getting better results, when I started trying to help the individual tap into their own intuition, their own knowledge base. Now that I know a lot of people, Erin just told us her story, right? Where she healed from stop listening to everything else and start paying attention to Erin. I have the same story, and you'll find story after story after story. That is part of the reason I have changed tactics in the second half of my career, or I should say the last quarter of my career, and actually going in a whole new direction, is because to me, I'm interested now in the psychology of what allows people to go on their own healer's journey, which would be the version of the hero's journey or heroine journey. Let's just call it the healer's journey. When people actually take that on, now I think it changes the game. It's not a matter of if it's going to happen and if they're going to heal. It's going to be when they're going to heal, because they're going to stay open-minded. They're going to get out of that dualistic thinking, that binary thinking that Aaron mentioned, and they're going to begin to find real solutions. Now, is functional medicine doing that? I think it's better than traditional medicine, but I would say it's not doing it that much better. It's a different approach that's still a dualistic, team-based, modality-based approach. And I think what we need is a more individual approach. And so let's begin to just turn the table here now, Aaron, and start to talk about, if you agree with that, what I would like to do is, how do we then do that in practice, right? You mentioned functional medicine is root cause medicine. So how do we begin to truly individualize this and get people on this healer's journey so they can actually find what's the cause for them? And I just want to make sure I get it right. So you talked about the physical body, right? You talked about the mental body. You talked about the emotional body. And then what was the fourth one?
Energy body.
The energy body. So it would be the spiritual body, right? And so in your model, does this begin to account for that? Because I love the way you describe this as different on ramps depending on where you are in your journey, sort of coming into this. And so I'm curious on how you would begin to say, okay, we have listeners who are listening to the two of us. The last thing we want to do is just get on here and rant about what's wrong with this and that. Let's try to help them understand how we might begin to approach this from an individual point of view. And obviously, they're going to have to do the work. But how would we start?
First of all, it's a lot more fun to rant and complain than it is to provide solutions.
Yes,
it's easier at that. So fine, we'll do it. If I could summarize what I do in a nutshell, it is teach people how to self-source their own answers rather than outsource their own answers. And it's kind of, you said it's like a team, but it's almost like co-pilots, where something that rubs me the wrong way is when I hear practitioners say, oh, I healed this person. It's like, no, you didn't, because you don't have the capacity to heal somebody else, but you can show people and you can guide people to their own healing. And I think that's what we do. And we have to remember that really is our role as practitioner. It's not to heal other people. It's to hold space and create an environment and lead people to themselves, back to themselves. And sometimes this is a long process. So I've talked about intuition, for 15 years now, because it's something that it's a guidepost in my own life, is my own intuition. And so we can hear all this information. By the way, I do really love that approach, or that kind of perspective of all these voices. It is a way to guide people back to themselves, but we need to have some level of discernment or some tools to hone our own intuition. We all have this capability. We all have an inner knowing, but it's been blocked so many times over. And I will say, and maybe this isn't true, but I will speak, on behalf of my cohort, especially true for women. Because it's not, I don't want to just list out here's 3 simple steps to following your own intuition, but we need to unpack, why is it so hard? I remember a Janine Roth quote. She said, telling people to trust themselves is like throwing themselves to the wolves, because we have been taught since day one to not trust ourselves, to not trust our body, that our own innate urges and cravings are wrong, that our bodies are kind of gross, a little bit embarrassing, something to be hidden, something to be tucked away. When we do say hey, I've got this big thing coming up, maybe it's an emotion, we're told to be good little girls, don't cry. When we go to our doctor saying, hey, something's wrong, they say, no, it's not. You can't possibly know this. I remember years ago, I went to a gastroenterologist, and I was like, I really think I've got SIBO going on here. And sure enough, I had a positive SIBO test. And at the time, this was 8 years ago, low FODMAP diet wasn't a big thing. It certainly wasn't what it is now. And I remember saying to her, what about a low FODMAP diet? Is that something I should consider? And she literally laughed at me and she said, how do you know about that? So there's this idea that we can't possibly know. We can't possibly have the tools to our own healing. And so there's so many ways that we learn to divorce ourselves from our bodies and from our own intuition. So much of this is practicing bringing that back online. It's not as simple to say, oh, you just got to trust yourself. You just got to listen to your own needs. You just got to do what feels right. If you have 20, 30, 40, 50 years of practicing not listening to yourself, it's going to be a struggle. And so I honestly think that this is so much of the work that I do to individualize the medicine, is to continue to lead people and guide people back to themselves. So here's a real world, tangible way that I can do this, just like an idea or example off the top of my head. I had a client who was dealing with a lot of GI issues, and she was really convinced that she was reacting to foods. Now, I don't know your stance on food sensitivity testing. Not a huge fan myself, but it's a tool.
Not a huge fan. Yeah.
It's a tool that we can leverage, and we can sometimes leverage it in a way that helps people. Very rarely do I use them, but sometimes, like this situation, I did. And she kept saying to me, eggs, gluten, and dairy. She's like, I think those things are really causing me trouble. Now, what I could have said is, it's a waste of money to spend the money on food sensitivity testing. You know yourself. Just trust yourself. Just trust yourself and don't eat those foods. But she actually needed the data. So we ran the test, and guess what? She was reactive to eggs, to gluten, and to dairy. And so I use this as an opportunity to be like, hey, you knew this about you. You knew this about your body. And it was a way to really anchor herself into self-trust. Like, gosh, yeah, I do. And she came back around like 3 years later to be like, that was one of the most pivotal moments in my own healing journey, was learning how to trust myself. And so I kind of sometimes speak ill about functional labs, even though I do leverage them in our practice. But I think that they're a tool and we have to use them appropriately. And we have to recognize that there's a human being sitting behind the data. And so sometimes this data can be helpful, but not if we're just treating the data. We have to connect the data to the beating heart, to the human suffering that is behind the lab data. And if we can do this, this is an art. This is a real skill set. But if we can do that, I think that's what makes us like real, like kind of root cause providers. I don't know if that answers the question. But.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's beautiful. And I'll offer some take, and we could just kind of keep going on this for a little while. So part of my take for everyone is that one of the first things you need to understand, I believe, is to understand not how to read all the medical text, but how to read your own body. So part of my body of work has been the metabolism is speaking to you. It uses biofeedback. We all know what this is like. You have a headache, that's biofeedback. You have joint pain, that's biofeedback. All of you who listen to this podcast have heard me talk about sleep, hunger, mood, energy, and craving, schmeck, that silly word that is biofeedback for the body. So in Erin's model, that would be learning how to speak the language of your physical body. So that now just based on that, even if you had no other data, none of these fancy tests and nothing else, you could go, well, how does my body feel when I'm doing X, Y, or Z? And how does my body feel when I'm doing A, B, and C? That alone is a experiment of one. Now, how could we extend this into some of the other areas where we're talking about mental, emotional, energetic, spiritual? Well, guess what? Our body also speaks to us in the form of emotions. I have another acronym that many of you may not have heard because this is from my other work, but the acronym goes by AFRAID. So if you're stuck in anger, frustration, resistance, anxiety, insecurity, and depression, right? If you're stuck in these emotions, remember, emotions are meant to be felt, not lived. When you get stuck in these emotions and you're stuck in these things, these might help you understand that the body is communicating to you about some stuck trial, some stuck tribulation, some stuck trauma, some stuck pattern or obstacle in your life that you're not addressing. And this would be a way that your body's speaking to you emotionally. In the mental body, right? Your thoughts, your repeated thoughts, those thoughts that you unconsciously think that then trigger emotions. Those also are things that are clues for you. Synchronicities and serendipities versus recurrent patterns and repeated obstacles and those kinds of things. Those can tell you a little bit about what you're doing on your spiritual path, your purpose path, your energetic self, and is it moving in the right direction? And so there are many ways. I just covered a few here, just taking off of Erin's model, just different elements that you can use to think about the physical body, the mental body, the emotional body, the energetic/spiritual body, and the way that these bodies are speaking to you constantly. And then from there, like a detective, you can begin to say, what about this thought? What about this emotion? What about this recurrent pattern? What about these signs and symptoms are pointing me towards something that I am doing and or not seeing and or not addressing that are keeping me from my health? This to me is how you begin to individualize the process. And yes, there's lots of tools, books and podcasts and all of these things that you can avail yourself of. But if you get stuck in those tools, you never actually see the language of the full metabolism speaking to you, and therefore you remain lost. And so this is the way that I would begin to handle something like this as a beginning. Now, to begin to wrap up this conversation, Erin, why don't we just go through briefly? So with functional medicine, right, we have tools, we have fancy labs, we have different things that we can use. What would be some of the modalities that you think, in all these different avenues of the physical body, the mental body, the emotional body, the energetic body, that people could begin to experiment with and use that go beyond just this latest supplement and this latest diet fad or, metabolic conditioning, etc. What are some of the tools that we can use to begin to address some of the things that might be going wrong? And would you even agree with what I said? And is that something that you want to add anything to?
Yeah, that tracks and that lands. And I think for the sake of simplicity, like let's use a really simple, free, accessible tool, your body. We'll just make it really, really bare bones, because I love what one of my sheroes, the late Candace Pert, she says the body is the subconscious mind. So sometimes we can access, the subconscious mind speaks to us via the body. It plays out through the landscape of our body. So it's a ticket in. You brought up, well, I'll use this more from like an emotional perspective, but let's start with food, even just like simple. I have some program called the Carb Compatibility Project, and I created it 5 years ago in direct response to people being like, I need to do low carb to be healthy. I need to do low carb to lose weight. I'm like, okay, sure. Let's go on a low carb journey together. And each and every step of the way, what we're going to do is check in. So there's guidance built in. There's a framework to follow. We're not just throwing you to the wolves, but each and every step of the way, there's a checkpoint. How do you feel? How did you feel when you do this? Because people love to say, how many carbs do I need? And I'm like, I don't know. I can't possibly begin to tell you that. I've been doing this work for a minute, and even I can't tell you that. But you can tell you can self-source those answers. Let's show you how. So we're always checking back in with, how do I feel? How do I feel physically? How is my sleep? How is my exercise performance? How is my mood? Just the basic stuff that you teach all of the time. We're using our bodies as the instrument. We're using our bodies as the data. So that's one thing. But you had said something about resistance. And I want to use this as an example, because sometimes resistance is there for a reason. So resistance isn't always a bad thing. Sometimes it can be of our highest service. And somebody recently asked me, how do you know when resistance is something to actually like heed the message or push through? And my answer to that is I have two very different reactions in my body. So resistance for me, when I know it's a no, it's not really resistance. It's maybe like higher guidance or my own innate knowing or, wisdom from somewhere coming in. I literally feel like a physical sensation, a visceral experience of being like sucked back like a vacuum. That's when I know. That's my sign. That's my symbol. That's what my body shows me is a no for me. And when I don't feel that, but instead I move up into like the mental body of storytelling and kind of like running stories and running anxieties over and over, like it's like a train track. That's when I know the resistance is coming up, just because it's fear. It's pushing me to do something outside my comfort zone. And that's the resistance that I have to guide myself and carry myself through. That's the resistance I move through. But the only reason I know this is because I am in practice with dialoguing with my body. So for me, that looks like a daily meditation practice or a daily solitude practice. I live in the forest. I can go in the woods all of the time. I can sit in meditation, and I do that regularly. We are inundated with information. We've got the books and the podcasts and the blogs and the Instagram, and we just have information coming at us all the time. And people genuinely believe if I could just get more information, then I can fix myself, then I can heal. What most people actually have to do to make progress is to integrate the information that they're learning, is to take the time and the space to embody what they're learning, to run it through your physical body, to practice these things. And this is something I take so seriously, is creating space to dialogue, to learn the language of my body, to listen to it, and then to actually take action steps based on that internal guidance system. If my body is telling me to do something, I do it. And that's how I create change. That's where the transformation comes from. And so simple practices of, one, creating the space to be in dialogue, to be in communication with your body, to learn the language of your body. And this might take time, and that's okay. And then to even just ask yourself, like, show me a yes. What does a yes feel like in my body? I'm very kinesthetic, so I get a lot of feelings, but for you, it might be visual or it might be auditory. What does a yes look like? What does a yes sound like? Is there a visual representation or an auditory representation of what a yes is? Think about a time in your life that it was a yes. It was a hard yes. You didn't have to think about it. You didn't have to hem and haw. It was just super clear. This is a yes for me. What was that experience? How did you know it was a yes? And do the same thing for your nose. And so we start to create discernment using our own internal guidance system. And that is something that like nobody can take that away from you. That is probably one of the most important tools that you can cultivate and use in your day-to-day life.
Yeah, I love that. And it is really, to me, it's funny that I'm not surprised this conversation went in this direction, because when I think of functional medicine, the first thing I think about is it's dysfunction before disease. And dysfunction comes from many different things, not just diet and exercise. And dysfunction can't always be found in laboratory measures, even the newfangled functional medicine laboratories. Dysfunction, though, is almost always felt in some way, shape, or form, or an experience. That's why we notice something is off. To use Aaron's model, the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body, the energetic body, that is functional medicine. When you first start feeling dysfunction, there's an imbalance before it becomes dysfunction, before it becomes disease, right? And so from my perspective, it's a beautiful way to describe functional medicine, because how do we know to go looking anyway? Something feels off. And what I also love is that this is almost always the case in people's healing. So notice that as we were listening to Erin, she had this idea about resistance that then she understood. Oh, now I understand the difference between the two. And how I would describe that is I would describe it like there's resistance to fear and places that you know you want to go. And then there's just rejection, which is like, I need to reject that. Something feels so viscerally off about that. It's not just unfamiliar. It just feels not good at all. But you wouldn't know, and nor would Aaron or I be able to make such distinctions, which are only really good distinctions for us. They may not apply to you if we had not actually delved into the process. It's too bad that information is not seen as information, because literally, if it was seen that way, we wouldn't take it as gospel. We would take it the way Bruce Lee takes it, which is absorb what is useful, discard what is not, and continue to use what is uniquely your own. That to me is what information means. I'm in formation in terms of how my body is evolving and how my brain and my spirit and my emotions are evolving. So from that perspective, I think this is exactly what functional medicine should be, and what many of you are perhaps struggling with. And it's not here's the interesting thing about this, Aaron. Like, you and I will probably admit to this. Like, people listening to this is not a convenient conversation, right? Like, it's not like something where they're going to be, oh, great. Thanks, Aaron, Jade, for setting me straight. That's a lot of work. And I'll answer it, then I want you to answer it. But I just go, okay, well, keep doing what you're doing, because that is a ton of work and you're not getting any better. So what would you rather do? Spend the next 12 years doing this while you're getting worse, or spend like legitimately 1 to 3 years? It's not even probably going to take that long, for certain things, maybe if you're in, a pretty big illness. But yes, that's about what it takes, what I've seen clinically. And I want to see what your answer is. It can take as fast as 3 months for very few people, depending on the condition. And it takes up to 3 years for some of the big things like Crohn's disease and some of these things going into remission that I've seen in my career. But if you do it the old way, nothing's going to happen. And it's just as much work, in my opinion. What do you say to that?
Yeah, it's a lot of work to feel like shit all the time. It's like, that's not a good time. It's not a good hang. So I would choose like the hard work of healing over the hard work of being unwell anytime. I've done both, and I can tell you there's one that's a better option. It's funny because when the reason that I started my podcast was so I could deliver long form content, because people are like, just tell me the 3 foods I need to eat to heal RA. I'm like, so I need like 4.5 hours to talk about why that's not a great question.
Yeah.
But people are like, that's not going to land with people. People need the quick and dirty. And I'm like, I see people bigger and better than that. I hold people to a high standard, you know, and I've built a very, very successful, regenerative, sustainable business that touches the lives of thousands each week. So I actually reject that people need the easy button. Some people might be looking for that. I completely understand why, but some people are here. They're here in this lifetime to like do the real healing journey. And I joke that like so much of what I do is getting to the root of the root of the root of the root. And that might be a lifelong process. Like I'm still working on it. My physical health is great. I feel awesome, but I'm still every day, like I'm like stepping up to the plate to be like, okay, what's the lesson today? It's student consciousness. I'm forever a student. That is, I think, like the beauty of this lifetime is to be able to learn the deep lessons. And so is it convenient? No. You know, we're not choosing the twig in a stream path, but is it worthwhile? Like hell yeah. And you will learn so much. Like that's the beauty of illness sometimes, is it creates this opportunity to learn so much about yourself, to learn so much about how you perceive yourself and how you perceive the world and your place in it. And it gives you an opportunity to change that. Like that is real root cause resolution, is getting like deep into the bones of who you are and why you're like this, and to have an opportunity to change and rearrange that. To me, that's so exciting and beautiful.
Yeah, that's a beautiful way to say it. And let's just go through a couple questions that you and I will both answer, and then we can begin wrapping this up. That I just want to I'm curious. Like I'm curious for myself in terms of what you think about these things, and I think it'll be beneficial for the listener. So, to what degree do you think diet alone, whether you want to say it's a percentage or whatever, like, let's just say people are ill, just general illness. To what degree do you think on a percentage basis, like what percent, if they got their diet perfect, how many people do you think would heal? Another way to put this is, do you think, there's some people who think, you get the diet right, you can heal any cancer, any problem, anything, at all. I'm curious what your thought on that. How powerful really is diet alone, assuming people could eat the perfect diet for them? Let's just assume they're eating the perfect diet. We put them
whatever that is.
Whatever that is.
If you had asked me this 5 years ago, I probably would have said like 80%. Now I'm like, I've seen some things, like I've seen some things. And I think that beliefs, what you believe about your capacity and your ability to heal, far override what you eat. I really do. And so I think those can be a rate limiting step to your healing. And so if you have really limiting beliefs about your capacity and potential to heal and you're eating a perfect diet, I think that I don't know how to exactly quantify that in percentages, but I think that that's more important.
I'm glad I asked that question, because it's going to be shocking for people to hear this. Same with me. There was a quote at Bastyr University by Dr. Bastyr that was on the wall somewhere that said, your belief in your diet is more important than your diet, or something like that. And I remember looking at that and being like, that's bullshit. I was just like, bullshit, And now I'm like, damn, that dude knew exactly what he was talking about, because I'm in the exact same boat as you. And I would argue to say, I know people who are incredibly healthy, who did other things, who eat, a lot of what they want. They don't overeat, but they don't, they eat pastries, they have, wine, they do all the things, and they healed, or they healed. Now, is that saying diet stuff can't get in the way? Sure, it can. But I would say, I don't know, 30 to 50% is where I would come down on that, even if it's the perfect diet. Let's do this with exercise. To what degree do you think exercise and what I mean here is not movement. I mean, not walking and, that kind of stuff. I mean, hardcore exercise. To what degree do you think that is healing and the way to go?
Gosh, you're asking me this at a kind of a funky time. I feel like we have to do like 5-year check-ins. Like, where are you now?
Yeah, exactly.
Because I really have invested a lot of my resources, energy, time into putting on muscle mass. For context, I turned 40 in 6 months. So I'm like,
Erin, you look fantastic. I mean, I would not put you at 40. That's awesome.
I was fishing for that. Yeah. So I walk all the time. So movement is like paramount, but I've also been investing my time into strength training. And I will say that I feel stronger and more capable and more resilient than I've ever felt in my entire life. So right now I'm putting it kind of like high up there, to be honest with you. Like walking and strength training are just like, I don't know, they're my medicine. So for me personally, high, but I think that our bodies are designed to move. And so if, sedentary lifestyle will negatively impact your health, kind of like period.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm much lower than you, but higher than diet, because I just think the movement is more key. And let's do a couple fast ones. How about how about time in nature? Like, how important do you think that is? Time outside, time getting bright lights in your eyes, that kind of thing. I mean, more or less important than diet and exercise, equally important. What do you think?
I think that our bodies are ancient. Our minds, the stories that we make up in our minds, less so, right? So the way that we see health is dramatically different than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 150 years ago. But our bodies haven't changed. Our bodies are ancient, and they hold ancient wisdom. I wish we had as much reverence and respect for that. Unfortunately, we just live in a culture that is like, we need to see the science to like really prove this. But fortunately, so much of the current research and data really supports our need for that outside stimulus through natural light, through nature exposure. I would put that like right at the top of the ant pile. And this is where, in terms of like individualized medicine, this is when we have to think about circumstance and opportunities and what we have actual access to. I'm very fortunate. We've made the choice to live in the forest, so we could have good exposure to that. Not everybody has as much access to these things, so that we kind of have to keep that in mind too.
Yeah, I'm with you. I would say it's pretty important, right up there, maybe a little higher for me than exercise. And luckily for us, some of this research suggests that even, getting a big screen TV and going on YouTube and searching beautiful forest sounds and listening to that can have benefits of being outdoors. And couple more questions, two more questions, and then we'll end this. How about mindset and beliefs, and how powerful do you
100%.
think? Okay. So for you, yeah.
It's a hundo for me. Yeah. It's that important.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think let's just take the blue zone research. People just go, oh, it's because they eat a particular way, or oh, it's because they're outdoors, or oh, it's because, and I'm just like, it's because they have community and connection and purpose, and they have a place in their society. However, that's sort of a separate question. Now, if they believed, even if they were they were lonely and had no one around, I believe, but they had a purpose and a belief system around why they were doing what they were doing and had put meaning behind it, that could, make all the difference. So I also put that as number one. And and it's interesting, Erin didn't know I was going to ask her this question. I didn't even know I was going to ask these questions. But for two people that between the two of us, we probably got close to 50 years of clinical experience, it's interesting that we dovetail so powerfully on this. And my final question is, and you may have already answered it, but what is the most important from your perspective, taking into account you personally and all your clinical experience? What is the biggest thing that makes the biggest difference in people, getting through their healer's journey?
I think it's belief in oneself. Your boy, Brendan, the holistic savage.
Yeah.
He said something on your podcast, I don't know, sometime this year. And I was like, I was like, hot damn. He said, victim mentality is arguably like the biggest root cause that we have. And I could not believe more. And I sometimes grapple with like the use of the word victim. I think victim consciousness is a really good way to phrase it. But if we feel that things are happening to us and we have no agency over our experience, that really sets us up for a lot of pain and a lot of struggle. And again, not the convenient option to choose. It's like, which pill? But taking agency and believing that we can take agency and believing that we have the power to heal and our bodies can heal is I think the most important thing.
And my answer to this question may be depressing to many people.
I know.
I'm just going to come out and say it. And I believe this. Like, bottom line is, doesn't matter what we do, in my opinion, you You can eat all the right things. You can exercise all the right way. You can go get sun in your eyes. You can hang out in the woods. You can believe what you want, but you are going to get sick and you are going to die. We know that, 100%. There's never been a human who's lived forever. We're going to die. We're going to get sick at some point. So to me, I go, if that is the case, then what is the number one thing that we can do as humans so that when that time comes, we can look back and feel like we lived a life worth living, to be proud, to have fulfillment. And to me, that means to take our lessons and our hardships and turn them to good, to grow ourselves while we have the time, to enrich others, and to evolve the world and make it better in only the way that we can. Because ultimately, no matter what we do, we're not going to heal our way out of the predicament that we are in. We are going to age, we're going to die, we're going to get sick. So to me, how are we going to make it matter? And to me, this goes right to, Viktor Frankl, one of my favorites, which man's search for meaning, and this idea that if you make your life mean something and you find a deep convicted purpose, you can bear anything, absolutely anything, including healing yourself for the time being and getting yourself back vibrant so you can do the work. But also when that time comes, when you do have to pass, that that it makes a difference for you. And to me, that is really the strongest thing that we can have as humans. So final wrap up for you, Erin. Tell us where, any final thoughts you want to just leave us with, and then tell everyone where they can find you and work with you.
Final thought is, I just heard this quote this week, and it's kind of plays onto what you just said, which is suffering ends when meaning begins. And I think that's really beautiful. And I think that's the way that I like to live my life. Where you can find me, podcast and Instagram are the two places that I hang out the most. I am the Functional Nutritionist, functional spelled with a K, and same deal for the podcast, the Functional Nutrition Podcast. So would love to see you over there.
Yeah, Erin is an excellent educator. She's also super fun and makes things. She's something that I wish I was. I'm a good educator, but I'm not as nearly as entertaining as Erin. So, she has that great entertainment factor and education factor. So you'll really enjoy learning from her. And I was honored to be on her podcast as well. So check her out at the Functional Nutritionist, right?
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Erin, such a pleasure. Hang on real quick. I'm just going to shut down and make sure this all loaded up. But for all of you, I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Erin, and we'll see you at the next show. You have been listening to the Next Level Human podcast with Dr. Jade Teta. If you enjoyed this episode, please make sure you subscribe and consider leaving a review. You make the biggest difference when you pass on your lessons and inspire others. That's why reviews like this are so powerful. Your words may be the only ones that resonate for someone else. Please remember the information in this podcast is for educational purposes only. Always consult your personal physician or therapist before making any lifestyle changes. And finally, thank you for who you are in the world and the difference you make.